Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis Affamie History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past, what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you.
In this episode, Wendy Aris will be joined with guest Krystal DaCosta, who is an anthropologist working in digital media in New York City. We will be discussing her article, Who Are the Indigenous People That Columbus Met? So let's have a listen.
Thank you so much, Krystal DaCosta, for coming on to the podcast to speak about your article that you wrote of Who Are the Indigenous People That Columbus Met? And before we start, can I just have you just do a brief introduction of yourself?
Absolutely, yeah. So I'm Krystal DaCosta. I am based out of New York. My background is in anthropology and history. I don't work in those fields currently, but I'm very passionate about the intersection of history and social behavior and politics and all the things that bring us to where we are today.
Perfect. So I'll just start. And again, this is just, your perspective and your article. And as I said, it really connected because you brought the family connection to it.
Mm-hmm.
And why did you want to provide that family history into your article?
Yeah, it's a way of grounding what I wanted to talk about. So much of what I write about is very personal to me. That's more or less how I decide what topics I'm going to research and what I'm going to explore. And growing up in a Caribbean household, we were taught a very specific view of what the Caribbean is. And you have to, when you start to examine, I think, histories today, it's important to take the context of what you were taught previously. And that was my way of sharing some of that.
No, perfect. And in your article, you indicated that history that you learned of the Indigenous people of the Caribbean is different than what you learned later. Now, how did this change your perception of how you view the Indigenous of the Caribbean and how that history can be manipulated?
So we know that history is an interesting topic, right? It's built on the narratives of the people who have access and means to be able to create those narratives. And that doesn't always mean it's a reliable narrative or that it is true to what happened. I think my parents grew up in a time where the colonial presence was still very heavy in Trinidad, which is where my family is from. And so the histories that they were taught did not necessarily reflect the best possible experience of the first peoples who visited the Caribbean nations, right? Because they wanted to portray themselves as these saviors, as these conquerors. And it's only half of the picture.
Mm-hmm.
As a child, I've always been fascinated with the things around me and the past around me. Very much interested in learning about these people and these places that make up who I am. Mm. And so I was very quick to absorb a lot of the information that was given to me very early on. And when my family immigrated to the United States, that history came with me, but it impacted the way I thought other people would view me. And I don't know if that is making a lot of sense, but we were taught that in some ways, our culture wasn't as rich, right? We were a little bit backwards or a little bit slower. And I know all these things are not true about myself, this very vivacious, inquisitive, 4-year-old, 5-year-old. But that's not how I think other people saw me, because the history that I was being taught in Trinidad was also the history that's being taught here about these backward people, these savages who lived on the islands, right? And now we know so much of that is not true, not just for the Caribbean, but elsewhere around the world. The Peoples independently have very rich, vibrant cultures. I think as I got older and our ability to unearth that kind of information changed, and that door opened to me to be able to see a different perspective of who my people, my ancestors could have been. That was very appealing to me. And, as you start to learn more about where you come from, it lifts you up a little bit.
No, definitely. I definitely agree with that in terms of when you start peeling back that onion peel and start delving deep, it does give you a sense of belonging. It does gives you a sense of centeredness for what you're doing. And some of the terms used to describe the Indigenous people of the Caribbean, and how did this shape the image of the Indigenous people of the Caribbean?
Yeah, I mean, savages comes to mind like most easily, right? Like, so, and it's a meeting of others. So, that sense of being different is it is a protective measure, right? That does is it puts up a barrier, and it gives you permission to treat people badly, or to treat people in ways that help lift up your sense of power and your sense of belonging. And this was a first meeting on both sides. So I don't think either group really knew what they were entering into. But that perception of savagery, I think, has persisted throughout the history of the Caribbean.
And then, well, how do we think, do we ensure that these negative narratives, don't continue?
I think we're seeing a generational shift. I think I said this at the beginning. Like, my parents were taught a very colonial view of history. And it's sometimes challenging when I talk to my mom, for example, and I share that, I've learned something different about how these interactions may have gone between Columbus and the native people of the Caribbean. She's very proud of the fact that Columbus landed in Trinidad. But like when you start to probe into what that may have meant for the people currently living in Trinidad, that's not a conversation that she wants to have, right? Trinidad, she will remind me, was long regarded as the jewel of the British crown in the Caribbean. But what does that actually mean? What does that actually mean for the interactions that Trinidad has had with the crown and with its neighboring islands? There's a lot of racial division in Trinidad itself. There's very much a sense of, you said otherness before, but like this idea of like respectability that aligns with whiteness and the crown, that is still prevalent amongst a certain generation in the Caribbean. I think with time, right, as younger scholars enter the scene and younger scholars start to ask these questions, we'll see that narrative start to shift. I don't know if it's ever going to go away, because there exists these axes of power within the world that will be hard to topple. But I think what it can do, this awareness of your history, is just give you a sense of belonging and place in the world that challenges the notions that other people may hold of you. And it will slowly start to undo the histories that were written before we came about.
No, definitely. And then I guess this relates into the perception, the modern perceptions of Columbus. How should that change as well?
So it's interesting you bring that up. We're starting to see a shift on that as well. There was a great piece written in the Atlantic a few years ago that essentially dismantled the legacy of Columbus, and people aren't ready for that. Columbus Day here in the States and some states is not Columbus Day. It's Indigenous People Day. And people are not happy about that. They feel that they are losing this great tradition of discovery. But again, they haven't delved into what that discovery may have meant, or they don't want to acknowledge what that discovery may have meant because they're not necessarily impacted by it. I think also change is hard. Change is hard for people. And you're asking them to give up what they know and what they've built themselves on And that can be a hard thing to let go. So it means that they have to reinvent and re-examine their own identities. And I don't think we're quite done with that transition yet. Columbus definitely has a history and a place in the Caribbean. You can't discount that. But I think we have to examine the pedestal that he has been put on and ask if he really belongs there. And if we want to put him on a pedestal for certain behaviors and activities, then I think we have to acknowledge why we're doing that and what that actually means.
No, I definitely agree. And then I guess leads to, I guess, the experiences of the Indigenous people that met Columbus. You know, how does that reflect, I guess, the broader themes in the history of European colonization?
Yeah, I mean, we don't talk about that. We don't talk about their side of the story because that's not how history is created, right? So we know that it wasn't an easy meeting. We know that it was very likely a suspicious meeting on both sides. And then we get a one-sided view of how that went. Oh, they were welcoming. Oh, they were like children. Oh, they were so eager for the gifts that Columbus could bring. And then, some occasionally you'll get the peak of the violence. Oh, well, they were savage and brutes and they weren't civilized. And so we had to use force to rein them in. Well, why? Why? Because you were coming onto their land and you were taking their things and you were essentially abusing them. So let's talk about that side of the story too. Listen, it was an age of exploration, and give credit to the folks who got in boats and went to places that they hadn't been before, right? And they were doing things that no one else had the courage or the money to do. And there's something to be said for that. But we also, I think today in 2024, with the information that we have to acknowledge that they didn't have the tools to be well met because, again, the context of when they were traveling, right, and what they knew. But I think we have to be able to say that now, and it has to be okay for us to say that and look back at it and say, this didn't go well. And, it changed the trajectory of these nations, definitely. It opened the door for immigration and population and all of those things. But there were things there before. And it would be important to acknowledge that.
No, for sure. Definitely. And what role do you think education plays in reshaping the narrative about Columbus and the Indigenous people he encountered?
Yeah, well, it starts there, right? This is where we find out who we are. And granted, I am not, I'm not in the Caribbean school system, so I don't know what's being taught there, but I would hope that some of these stories are being told a little bit differently to the children who are currently in schools throughout the Caribbean. I know that I have a fourth grader or a rising fourth grader. They're barely going to touch upon the Caribbean history here in the US. And I understand that we're going to learn about US history and the revolution and all of those things that are important to us. But as part of the migrants out of the Caribbean, I think it's my responsibility to make sure that she has a little bit of a better understanding of that particular story. And so that's on me to help broaden that understanding for her.
Oh yeah, no, definitely. And then, Krystal, would you say that there's any areas that require, I guess, further research to this topic that you believe that would enhance the knowledge?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. And as I said, like I'm just dabbling in this area, but I would definitely love to learn a lot about exactly what was here before Columbus arrived. And I know that there are some great archaeologists and anthropologists who are making that their work, and hopefully we will have more of that information soon.
Perfect. And then I guess finally, as we just close out, what would be your, I guess, your final thoughts in regards to the narratives of the Indigenous people of the Caribbean to deconstruct and further the conversation?
I'd say just ask the questions, right? Ask the questions and talk to people, talk to folks from the other islands. I do think there is a little bit of separation that happens from folks who are from the islands. And there's a sense of pride, but I do travel pretty extensively to Jamaica and DR, and folks are warm and inviting, and some of those lines that we believe exist are not real. So ask the questions and get to know the people that are out there now and see what they know about, their own histories.
Perfect. No, thank you so much, Krystal, for coming on, and I do appreciate your time.
Hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcast. Thank you.